Hello everyone. Okay, so this is Understanding Macroeconomics Lesson 1. This lesson is just about an introduction to the models and a timeline of economics, in particular macroeconomics. So let's begin with a timeline, obviously. Let's put the past over here on the left and the future out to the right. And then way back, even before recorded history, we had a series of dictators and other assorted reprobates running command economies. People thought of them back in those days as like gods on earth, and what they said went, and if you didn't like it, well, they just would kill you. So even in modern days, we still have this, unfortunately. We have a bunch of dictators and other assorted reprobates even today. Some of them have rationalized their command economies as somehow they're better. Gee, I'm really smart and I can do this better than people under my command doing it on their own. But of course, they're all wrong. But we have that. So let's ignore modern day dictators for a moment, and let's just talk about the next thing that came along. And there was, at the same time that we had these command economies, there was a development of markets. In economics, we called it spontaneous order. Adam Smith has a clever phrase. He talked about the tendency of human beings to truck and barter, which was his kind of 18th century language in an attempt to talk about how it is in people's nature to trade with each other. So this trading created a kind of a spontaneous order, using economics words, that made life better for everyone. And then we had in recorded history, even in kind of semi-modern times, we had this idea of mercantilism. So it'd be the 16th century, but really we had it before that. We had it all the way up to Adam Smith. And mercantilism is this idea that the nation, that is the government of the nation, can best decide what to produce, how to produce it, and who should get it, and not individuals through their individual actions of trucking and bartering, like Adam Smith called it. So one of the particularly bad ideas in mercantilism was this idea that exports are good and imports are bad. Actually, exports are the cost, really. Things that we have to export are the cost of the things that we import. But anyway, under mercantilism, exports are bad and imports are good. And even in modern days, we don't use this word mercantilism anymore, but we still have a lot of people, probably some of you, who think that the basic tenets of mercantilism are okay. That is, that the state should decide what you should be able to buy and what you should not. Whether or not, for example, you should be able to buy Canadian lumber to build your house, even though Canadian lumber is cheaper and maybe even better than southern yellow pine, but there's taxes on Canadian lumber preventing us from buying as much as we might want. All of that is kind of mercantilism. Then, of course, we have this guy, Adam Smith, who wrote his famous book that you might know as The Wealth of Nations in 1776. But the full title was An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. And Smith's book was basically an attack on mercantilism. He just, chapter after chapter, laid out the logic on how that markets were better. Smith claimed that nations don't get wealthy by accumulating gold and focusing on exports instead of imports, that nations become wealthy instead by specialization and trade. And if you just take a second to think about your own decisions, like, why are you in this class? You are studying hard to become highly specialized in a very narrow field. And that specialization will make you very productive in that very narrow area. But you can't eat that. You can't heat your home with your special knowledge. So your idea is to be productive in that very narrow field and trade for the other things that you might want, like food and housing, entertainment, healthcare, and so forth. Adam Smith said, nations become wealthy by specialization and trade. And it is only because of that insight that modern life is so much better than it was 2, 3, 400 years ago. Okay, so there was Adam Smith at 1776. Then shortly after that, one of his young proteges, David Ricardo, in the 1800s, is sometimes called the founder of modern trade theory. So he's the developer of comparative and absolute advantage, which we will talk about probably in week 7. And then there was Alfred Marshall in 1890. So this is a little more than 100 years later. Alfred Marshall is the first person to recognize that we can describe basic economic ideas with simple algebra. So Marshall invented the supply and demand curves. In fact, they are called Marshallian demand curves and Marshallian supply curves. There was another guy, his name was Walras, and he also developed the idea of demand and supply curves, but he did it slightly different. But we mostly use Marshallian supply and demand curves. Now keep in mind that when Marshall did this, he focused on equilibrium. He applied mathematics, but the goal all the time was to solve for some equilibrium condition. There were another group of economists down at the University of Vienna in Austria. We call them the Austrian school. They followed Adam Smith to a different place, and they focused instead on process. So in the Austrian school, they didn't care so much about equilibrium because they felt like equilibrium was constantly moving around as resource prices went up and down and new technology was developed and so forth. So they focused on process. It was a very dynamic approach to understanding the economy, where Alfred Marshall's approach, although very mathematical, was in fact a very static approach. So starting at about the start of the 1900s, we have these two different groups of economists moving forward. It's not that they thought the other group was wrong, they just thought that the other group was in a not very productive way of looking at things. Okay, so then, of course, the Great Depression comes, starting in October 1929, the Great Depression, and it just was like a tidal wave all across economics and really across all institutions, but especially economics. The Great Depression really rattled people's assumptions. So it basically called into question Alfred Marshall's ideas and the Austrian school's ideas. So after the Great Depression, there's this guy, John Maynard Keynes, who wrote the General Theory in 1937. So like Smith's book, which was an attack on mercantilism, what existed before Smith, Keynes's book was an attack on what existed before, which was, since he was from the English-speaking world, which was classical economics. Keynesian theory is an attack on classical economics. A little piece of trivia that you might want to know is that John Keynes was a student of Alfred Marshall's. I've often wondered how Marshall felt that one of his students became famous, but became famous by basically saying that everything that Marshall had taught him was wrong. So if you do that to me, I'll be so proud that you're famous, and it won't matter to me too much, I don't think, that you would tell everybody that everything I taught you was false. But anyway, so John Keynes wrote the General Theory, and it had such a big impact that these other schools slowly faded away. Now it took a while, so he wrote this book in 1937. So it's not like all the tenured econ faculty all across the Western world just kind of said, oh my, everything we thought is false and Keynes has it all right. It wasn't really like that. It took a long time for the economic profession to slowly be won over. And so most people think of the 60s, especially from 1960 to 1968, as the golden age of Keynesian economics. So see, there's a few years past there. And in this period, there was unbelievable optimism about the future because people thought, it sounds a little funny to say it now because we know it's not true, but in the 60s, people truly thought that through the prescriptions of the Keynesian model, that is, through the judicious use of monetary and fiscal policy as prescribed by Keynes, that we could end for all time the cyclical nature of the economy. It was called the Golden Age of Economics. And if this class wasn't so compressed, I could give you several examples of the kind of unbelievable optimism people had in those days. But by the late 60s, things began to crack a little bit in the Keynesian model, and the Keynesian model lost favor with some economists, and there was a return to classical and Austrian economics as a viable alternative to Keynes. So now here we are in the present, looking out into the future, and there are really three dominant models about how the economy works. Keynes is probably still the most popular. I would put him at, maybe half, maybe not quite half, but somewhere close to half of all economists would probably subscribe to the Keynesian model. And then the other two models, classical model would probably be second, and the Austrian model third. But they are all viable approaches to how the economy works. So that's where we are at the moment. Now, so what will we do in this section? Well, we will study all three models. I'm not going to present one of them to you as the truth and tell you that the other two are really wrong or stupid. No, you will, hopefully, by the end of this session, be able to articulate the assumptions in each approach and be able to understand the recommendations that each approach makes. It's okay with me if you form your own opinion. So you can have your opinion, but if I ask you on a test to describe for me why classical economists think that we shouldn't engage in fiscal policy, you need to tell me from their assumptions why they are led to that opinion. If you just wrote, well, they're obviously wrong, that we should do something else, that won't be a good answer. So to do well in this section, you need to understand or be able to, get in the head, if you want to use that phrase, get in the heads of Keynesian economists, classical economists, and Austrian economists. Okay, so now in this last slide, I just want to give you a brief summary of the basic macro models. So we had at first mercantilism, this idea that the state can decide things and they will decide well. And then from mercantilism in modern language, we have this idea of managed trade, that the state, the president and the Congress together will decide that we want to subsidize production and we want to tax away something else maybe. But managed trade is a very neutral term, and another term that's probably more accurate, at least from my perspective, is crony capitalism, because every industry in the nation will lobby the government to be in the favored group, right? And they'll have all kinds of reasons for why they are special and they need to be favored and why their competitors need to be taxed away. And that's truly crony capitalism. It's not a good thing. Anyway, so there's mercantilism, and then there was Adam Smith. So Adam Smith brought to us this idea of spontaneous order and that nations become wealthy by specialization in trade. And from Smith there was this division. There was the classical approach that focused on equilibrium, and there was the Austrian approach that focused on dynamics. Under the classical model, we have this thing called the equation of exchange. This is the only macroeconomic model that pre-exists Keynesian economics. We had the equation of exchange, and we will go over that in this class. From the Austrian model, we have this idea of the Austrian business cycle theory, where they talk about false signals coming to us principally from the central bank and low interest rates, causing businesses to invest in the wrong areas. Austrian business cycle theory. And then, of course, Keynes comes on the scene and like a tidal wave washes over all the others, and everybody is slowly won over to this Keynesian idea. But by the late 60s, the Keynesian idea, it's obvious that it's not completely right, and people begin to question it. And so Keynes doesn't disappear, but it now is much less dominant than it was, say, in the 60s. So after Keynes, the classical model kind of is reborn, and we have this thing we call the Neoclassical model, which we will discuss in here. We have monetarism, which comes to us from Milton Friedman. Probably Keynes and Milton Friedman would be the two most famous economists from the 20th century. So Friedman had his ideas about how to manage the economy, and sometimes it's called monetarism. Then we have Friedman's rule, which is quite interesting. Friedman actually thought that it was a bad idea to have discretionary monetary policy, which is what we currently have, and he thought it would be better to just have a rule for the central bank to follow that it would use to make decisions about expanding the money supply. Friedman's rule. Then in modern days, a lot of authors of textbooks try to blend all this stuff together. Sometimes it's called the Keynesian classical synthesis. I really think it's a bad way to do it because they don't blend well. It's like water and oil. You can shake them up and they look like they've blended, but let them sit for just a few minutes and they will separate out. But anyway, we have this thing called the Keynesian classical synthesis, and from it we have this guy John Taylor, who's kind of a monetarist, but he's really eager to try to pull in the best parts of all the models. And we have this idea called Taylor's rule, which we will cover. Alright, so that's it. So in the next lesson, we will start with how to measure economic performance, because without that, we can't talk about how the models work. So next up, how to measure economic performance, and we're going to go over 5, maybe 6 different metrics. Okay, good luck.